as she said, my name is Sean Chandler, and in 2.5 years, I was able to turn my nerdy hobby of talking about movies way too much into a full-time career on YouTube. I started my YouTube channel in July of 2016. I took my wife on a date night to go see the Lady Ghostbusters movie, and if you don't know the internet discussion surrounding that movie, if you liked the movie, it meant that you were a moron. And if you disliked the movie, it's because you were sexist. The internet loves nuance. So the next day I was like, you know, maybe I can post a non-crazy review of this movie. And less than 3 years later, I was able to turn my nerdy hobby into a full-time career on YouTube. And it's pretty cool. I've got a picture right up here of me on that's a picture of the Global Leadership Summit Austin. There we go. There's a picture of me on a red carpet at an awards show with celebrities. Right after this picture was taken, I walked down the red carpet and I bumped into Terry Crews, who was doing an interview. If you don't know who Terry Crews is, he's a massive human being built like a tank. And I bumped into him while he was doing an interview. So for the rest of my life, I get to name drop that I bumped into Terry Crews while he was giving an interview. And I'd like to think that he also name drops me sometimes about the time that I bumped into him on a red carpet. I'm a Rotten Tomatoes certified critic, which is cool because for over 20 years, I have been using Rotten Tomatoes, and now I'm one of them, which still kind of blows my mind. If you're like my mother, you're wondering, how does someone make a living on YouTube? But if you have kids under the age of 18, you know that every kid wants to be a YouTuber when they grow up, and I quite literally watch movies for a living as my career. It's the dream. I get to do something that I love, that I would and did do for free as a career. But that's the romanticized version of my story. That's the fantasy simplified version. In 2.5 years, I turned my nerdy hobby into a full-time career. If you know anyone's success story, you know it's always a lot messier than that. See, the reality is that I had 20 years of failures before I found success. And more importantly, when I went on that date with my wife in 2016, that was about rebuilding trust. Because I was unemployed, I was unemployable, and I was in addiction rehab at the time. It was the lowest point of my life. So to understand my story, you really have to go back to my childhood, and I had a very tumultuous childhood where my dad was a functioning alcoholic, which meant he was so fun to everyone that knew him in real life. He was productive at work, and he was drunk out of his mind every night with our family. Growing up, my sister and I had daddy stories where we would tell all these wacky, wild stories of his crazy hijinks. And I remember one time in my early 20s, I'd started working with the teenagers at my church, and I started telling one of these hilarious daddy stories about the time he grabbed a 2x4 and he hit my sister with it, and then he hit me with it because we needed a new spanking spoon, and no one was laughing at my funny story. And it clicked in my brain. Oh, if any one of my students told me that exact same story, I would be legally obligated to report it to the authorities because it's not a funny story, it's a story of abuse. So I had a very chaotic childhood. And in fact, my dad drank himself to death when I was 20 years old. So growing up, movies, nerdy stuff, that was my escape from the pain of life. In fact, way back in 1993, 30 years ago, when we got our trial disc for AOL, 5 free hours of the internet. I got on the World Wide Web, and the first thing I did is I checked out every single movie webpage on the internet, which didn't take long because it was 1993, so there was only 3 movie websites. But that was my escape. And soon afterwards, I put up my own website in 1998. It was a Jackie Chan fan webpage. We've got a picture of this. I bet you're wondering, is that the best Photoshop of 1998? No, it is not. But it is the best a high schooler could do with Microsoft Paint. In 1998, there was a picture of Jackie Chan's body where you could click on the different body parts, find out in which movie he injured which body part. So I ran this for about a year and then I quit. This was 20 years before I had success on YouTube. 20 years of failed projects trying to talk about movies on the internet. But so for me, growing up, I wasn't a rebellious kid. I never drank alcohol in high school. I just saw what it did to my dad, and I thought, I don't want any part of that. But when I was 21 years old, one of my friends came over one day, and his brother had been in an accident, probably had attempted suicide, and was in a medically induced coma. So my friend came over with some alcohol, and he wanted to drink with me, to just drink away the pain of the day. And I thought to myself, I know I shouldn't drink, but today's bad enough. This is a bad enough thing that it's probably okay for me. And that little lie, if the day's bad enough, it's okay, would wreak havoc on my life over the next 10 years, that little lie. And when I say this, I'm not making a broad statement about what other people should do with alcohol, but in light of my family background, in light of my own nature of having an addictive personality, I knew I shouldn't head down that path. But that little lie told me that it was okay. But for the next few years, life actually went really good for me. And so I met my wife, went off to Bible college. I ended up becoming a youth pastor at a church here in the Austin area, and I was like the total cliche youth pastor. There used to be a blog called Stuff Christians Like, and back 15 years ago, they put out a post on all the stereotypes of a youth pastor with the spiky frosted tip hair, the necklace, the goatee. I read it and I went, I have never felt so seen. This guy gets me. He's making fun of me, but he gets me. Like, in fact, first time they had me preach in big church, I brought eggs as an illustration. I started smashing them on stage. Everyone over 50 is like, what's wrong with this guy? All the teenagers are like, I love this guy. And in fact, the fact that I'm still calling it big church should tell you just how long I was a youth pastor. But when you work at a church, you know everyone. Well, not if you're at a mega church because there's too many people, but if you're at a normal sized church, you know almost everyone. And you love everyone, and you care about everyone, and you know everything going on in their lives. And there's a lot of pain in this world. And that little lie, if it's a bad enough day, crept into my life. There was a lot of bad days in people's lives, and I carried that burden, and I used that as an excuse to drink a little bit and a little bit more. So what started as once a month turned into a couple times a month, once a week, couple times per week. And I remember in 2011, there's a day after a long Sunday of church activities, I got home, had a little bit to drink, nothing that if any of you saw how much I had to drink, none of you would think, whoa, that guy's got a problem. But for me, it was unwise. And I remember walking into the kitchen, and I grabbed the refrigerator door and I opened it at just the right angle so my wife couldn't see what I was doing. And I got another drink. And I had this moment where I paused and I thought, wait, that's what alcoholics do. I saw the red flag, but I didn't stop. I kept going. Some of you hearing this right now, you know what's going on in your life. You've seen some red flags and you need to stop. And I was living right up to the edge of wisdom, of what I could sustain without losing control. There was no margin for if bad things happened. And then in December 2012, a girl in our community committed suicide. A couple months later, a student in my small group at the church committed suicide. The keyboard player at the church died in a car accident. And this year started of tragedy and death after death. And I started that window of time on the edge. And I immediately went tumbling over into full-blown alcoholism, where it went from, I need an excuse to drink, to I can't stop. And I'd repeated the exact cycle that had killed my father 10 years before. But I was a pastor at a church, and so much of your job when you work at a church is based off your reputation. So I was like, well, if I come forward, will I lose my job? How will I support my family? What do I do now? And I just felt trapped in the middle of this without knowing what to do or where to turn, and feeling so alone at that time. And I know there's a lot of church leaders, church staffs in here. I just want to throw the question out there. Does your church staff invite confession, or do you have policies that push people to hide their sins to avoid repercussions? Does your staff get the same pastoral care when they come forward as anyone else in the church would get? And I understand it's complicated. I totally get it. I think a lot more churches need to wrestle with how they show grace to their staffs. So for me, for 3 years, I tried to keep it a secret. Tried to fix myself, and through my willpower, I could stop drinking for a few months, and then it would just swing back and slap me again and take over. And for years, this was going on. And in fact, my son was born in 2012. My oldest daughter was born in 2014. I barely remember the first few years of their lives. And honestly, I don't really want to remember most of that time. And when I see pictures from the first few years of their lives, I see myself and I see the pain in my eyes. I don't know if anyone else can see it, but I hate looking at pictures from that time period. And I lost that time with my children. So finally, in June of 2016, I'd had enough. And I decided that I have to change. I have to be a better husband, father, pastor, disciple. I am tired of the lies, the shame. And it says in James, God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. The proud person says, I can fix myself. The humble person says, I can't, but you can. The proud person says, I care more about what people think about me. The humble person cares more about their character. So finally, in June 2016, I was going to do whatever it took to get healthy. So I went to the leadership of my church, wrote a letter confessing everything that was going on, resigned from the church, and said, whatever it takes, I'm submitting to you guys to get healthy, be healthy. And as a little mini rabbit trail right here, 7 years later, I'm still attending the same church that I was on staff at. That I know so many people have stories when they have moral failings as a member of staff or an elder at the church, they're run off. There are still churches that understand the gospel and grace. And so like they had me do the announcements last Sunday, and I'm going to be preaching again in big church in a couple of months. There's a few churches that still get it. But in June of 2016, I was unemployed, unemployable, and I had no idea what was next. So a few weeks later, trying to rebuild trust with my wife, I took her out on a date night to go see Lady Ghostbusters. In fact, we have a picture from that night of all the pictures to take for this day that changed the trajectory of our lives. The Snapchat filter, that's the one we have. Ta-da! But we watched the movie. The next day, I was unemployed. I had nothing to do. So I went back to my childhood escape of talking about movies on the internet. So, posted a review on the internet, and that was the start of my YouTube channel. The lowest time in my life. But when you start on YouTube, it doesn't pay money, so I needed a job. I applied to a bunch of different places. The one interview I got was for delivering paint. So I showed up, I bought some new shoes, bought a new suit. I walked into this office, and dirty as can be, chairs covered in paint. Sit in my nice new clothes in the paint-covered chair. The guy walks in, covered in paint, disheveled, 8 years younger than me, and have this moment where, really have to swallow my pride. And in fact, the reason that I was able to get the job delivering paint is because I was able to pass a drug test. I was in rehab at nighttime, but I could pass a drug test. So for 2.5 years, I drove around Austin delivering paint. And in fact, yesterday we watched a video talking about the foundations communities. As we were watching it, I was like, hey, I recognize that property. Their 4 Points property, I'm pretty sure I delivered a lot of pallets of paint to that property as it was being built. So 2.5 years, 8 hours a day, I would deliver paint in the hot Texas sun, come home, spend a few hours with my wife and kids. Once they went to bed, I would shoot a video, edit a video, post it, and Glenn, I would live off 4 hours of sleep and a lot of Red Bull. A year in on my YouTube channel, I had 1,000 subscribers. That was a big win compared to everything else I'd done, but I only made $11. Excuse me, that's actually not true. I'd started a membership site, and my mother joined as my one member. So as soon as you factor in my adult allowance, I was making $21 per month. But delivering paint plus $21 didn't quite pay the bills. So for a little bit, I was thinking about quitting YouTube entirely. And I started applying at churches again and trying to figure out how can I support my family. But I thought, I think there's something to this YouTube thing. Like, I'm gonna try and make it work. So I tried to do some real obvious evaluation. When I do this type of video, it gets 100 views. And when I do this type of video, it gets 500 views. I'm not great with math, but 500 is more than 100. What if I make this the priority? Then I went, Sean, you wouldn't watch any of your videos because they're too long. What if you made your videos a length that you yourself would actually watch? Oh, I'm a thinking man. So I made some of these tweaks, and in November 2017, I had my first video take off. And we're not talking Mr. Beast numbers, we're not talking Dude Perfect numbers, we're not talking millions, but it was doing just enough to fill that gap between what I needed to make and what delivering paint offered. And when money was off the table, I had this realization. The only reason I'm applying for a job at a church right now is for money. And getting a job at a church for money and not for calling is a recipe for disaster. So I went to my wife and I said, hey, do you want me to go back on staff at a church? She goes, no, I do not. And obviously we're still plugged in our church, but being on staff at a church is a different thing. And so I went hard to work trying to make this YouTube thing work. And a few months later, I was making more money on YouTube than I was delivering paint. Granted, delivering paint doesn't pay that much, but it meant there was hope there, that this was working. So I went to my wife, and I'd screwed things up royally the last few years with my issues. So I went to her and I said, I think this YouTube thing's gonna work, but I don't want to mess your life up so I can watch movies for a living. I don't want you to worry about things because I'm chasing my dreams. What is every fear you have about me going full-time on YouTube? Every concern? She's like, this and this and this and this and this. We made this gigantic list. That was my checklist. I've got to check everything off, and as soon as I do that, then I can go full-time on YouTube. So I spent the next year making my way through the checklist. And in February 2019, put in my 2 weeks notice, went full-time on YouTube. I lined it up right with when Avengers Endgame came out, biggest movie of all time. I rode that wave of momentum for 9 months. It was fantastic. And then we got to 2020 when the whole world shut down and no movies came out for a year. And when you review movies for a living and no movies come out, that's a problem. But remember what I just told you, I had the wife safety plan. So we had this whole security plan. I thought it was to make my wife less afraid. As it turns out, it was actually the COVID plan. So made it through, fantastic. Everything went great. And coming up in a few months, I'll have been full-time on YouTube for 5 years. Something that I would do for free, that I did do for free for 20 years. Failed at for 20 years. The dream finally came true. I do something I love. I get to pick up my kids from school. Actually, they're old enough they can walk home. So I lost that little piece, but for several years, every day I go pick up my kids from school. And I get to be present in a way that my dad wasn't present for me. To put a little epilogue on this story, in May of 2019, I was asked to speak at Career Day at my kid's school. YouTuber, it's an interesting career because it didn't exist when I was in grade school and when most of you were in grade school. And every kid wants to be a YouTuber, so they wanted me to be the keynote speaker for all of the kindergartners or whatever. So all the kids. So they put me in the computer lab, which was the big, gigantic room. So I walk into the computer lab and I put my things down on a table and I look around the room. And I had this realization that I had actually been in that room before. See, I left a little piece out of my story, which was in July of 2016, the same month I started my YouTube channel. I did 2 weeks of day labor work building desks and tables at a school in my neighborhood. And so the previous time I had been in that room was the lowest point in my life, where all I could see is all I have in life is building desks, poorly because I'm not handy. That's all I had. No hope. I thought my life was over. And then 3 years later, I'm in the same room with a dream job, invited to be the keynote speaker for all the kids, present with my children. My family was healthier and happier than they had ever been. And I just had this moment where sunk in, wow, I got a second chance. And in a room this size, some of you almost certainly are in the middle of your own struggle and you have no idea where to turn. And that was me. I thought if I come clean, I will lose my influence. This is it. But that was the opposite of the truth. My vulnerability only grew my influence. I know there's people in this room, you're probably in the middle of a struggle and you're thinking if I come forward, my life will be over. And you're afraid of the cost, and I get it. 2016, coming clean, was unbelievably painful. You know what was more painful? The years of shame and lies and secrets. You know what was more painful? Losing years with my kids, where I was a terrible father and don't even remember those years. If you're in the middle of your own struggles, and you're afraid you don't know where to turn, the Bible says God is able to do immeasurably more than we can ask or imagine according to his power that works so mightily within us. God opposes the proud, and he gives grace to the humble. Do you trust him? The thing which I failed at the most and for the longest period of time is where I ended up finding the greatest success in my life. Your failures don't define you. My failures didn't define me. My biggest failure paved the way for my biggest success. When I thought my life was over, greatness was just around the corner. Thank you.